It's midnight, the sky is clear and the moon bright. You stumble into a woodland clearing or a field outside the village, a place where no one goes after dark. And here they gather. Women mostly, some men, arriving on foot, on broomsticks, on the backs of animals that should not carry riders. The air is full of smoke, the smell of tallow and burning resin. There is music, pipes, drums and rhythms that do not belong to the church. There is feasting, dancing, bodies moving in ways daylight does not permit. And at the centre, a horned figure, cloaked and seated on a throne of bones. The devil, they often called him, sometimes an older demon without a Christian name. He presides over these dark proceedings. He receives oath. He marks flesh. He inverts sacraments. And so it is clear, this demonic gathering has structure, hierarchy, and possibly the most haunting feature is that it clearly has purpose. This is the Witches Sabbath, or at least as it appeared in confessions, in demonological treatises, in woodcuts and paintings that tried to capture what words could barely contain. It's important to say this clearly from the outset. The word witchcraft can and has been applied to many, many different practices across cultures worldwide and throughout history due to similar rituals, practices, and underlying beliefs. But this story concerns a very specific historical fear, one that emerged within Christian Europe, where witch became a label used to criminalize certain forms of knowledge, power, and practice, and to justify extraordinary violence. Thousands died for this, executed, burned, tortured until they named others who had been there, who had flown, who had kissed the devil's hand or worse. And yet the story itself is unstable. The details shift by region, by decade, by interrogator. Almost everything we think we know about the Sabbath comes from those who were trying to destroy it, because the Sabbath was not only feared as a gathering, but as a sign that something older, harder to control, might survive suppression. So what kind of idea becomes powerful enough to justify killing? Welcome, seekers, to an exploration of a story powerful enough to terrify nations. And we ask, why is the Witches Sabbath so feared? If you enjoy these videos, please do consider liking and subscribing. We really appreciate the support. Now, let us begin. Even before the earliest witch trials of the 14th century, there were other nighttime occurrences. In medieval Europe, folklore preserved older traditions that existed long before witchcraft became a crime. These were stories of the night flight, women who rode with Diana, a classical goddess remembered in medieval belief as a leader of nocturnal processions. Or maybe they rode with Holder or Perkta, folkloric figures associated with winter, judgment, and the wandering of souls. Or maybe with other, unnamed spirits whose identities shifted from place to place. There was also the mythical wild hunt, thundering across the sky, processions to fairy hills, and spirit journeys in which the body remained while the soul travelled elsewhere. These were not organised, and certainly were not conspiracies. They were experiences, reported, remembered, half-believed, sometimes condemned by the church as illusion or delusion, sometimes tolerated as peasant superstition rather than heresy. These stories were fragmentary, locally varied, and largely ambiguous. They were not the Witches' Sabbath, but they recurred often enough to provide the material from which it would later be built. The historian Carlo Ginzburg traced these threads carefully. He showed how night journey traditions, scattered across centuries and regions, formed a deep underlayer beneath later witch trial narratives. Not because the traditions themselves were dangerous, but because learned authorities began to reinterpret them as fragments of a single unified hidden pattern. By the 15th century, theologians and lawyers were constructing a unified theory of witchcraft, not out of curiosity, but necessity. Christianization across Europe was largely complete, but it was uneven in practice. Local belief persisted, and healing traditions survived. People continued to claim and practice knowledge that did not come from scripture or priesthood. And for many communities, this knowledge still carried real power, the danger to the church being that it existed outside centralized, standardized authority. Power that could not be easily overseen, regulated, or absorbed into the structures of church and state. These practices were rarely organized, and they were not necessarily, in essence, a rival religion, but they were difficult to regulate, difficult to define, and therefore difficult to govern. And so, to exert final control over these populations, these beliefs needed to be made more tangible, more solid, and more worthy of eradication. They needed to be made heretical and criminal. Fragmentary superstition could be tolerated or dismissed. Visions, dreams, and local spirits could be explained away. But a crime that could be prosecuted consistently across regions required structure. The Sabbath provided that structure. It was no longer a scattering of night journeys or folk beliefs about spirit processions. It became conspiracy, a supposedly consistent counter-church activity, a widespread rival religion with its own ritual, its own hierarchy, its own sacraments, all inverted and all demonic. The Malleus Maleficarum, written in 1486, codified much of this. It described witches gathered in covens, flying to remote locations where they worshipped the devil, renounced Christ, committed blasphemy and obscenity. The details were precise, repeatable, and with that, exportable. Initially, this provided an idea of what answers to expect and what constituted proof. Not of an act, but of membership in a hidden, organised enemy to the church. But swiftly, this standardised guide firmly in place, fear building, accusations rife, pressure mounting to clamp down, confession began to follow expectation. What suspects described increasingly mirrored what interrogators already believed to be true, so much so that confession became something to be extracted from the individual, regardless of its truth. This was not always through torture, though torture was common. Sometimes it was exhaustion, leading questions and social pressure, the promise of mercy if you named names, the threat of worse if you did not. But once the script existed, confessions of course began to match it. The Sabbath acquired consistency. Not because it was real, but because authorities now knew what they were looking for, who they believed they were facing, and how to identify it. And once the Sabbath could be named, described and recorded, it multiplied. These supposed demonic gatherings spread. Regional panics escalated. In the Basque Country, in the Pyrenees, in Scotland, in Germanic territories, these Sabbaths were confessed to, described in detail, testified about under oath. Each new confession confirmed the existence of the last. The pattern itself became proof. And it is no accident that women appear so often within these accounts. They were already closest to the thresholds that fear gathered around. Healing, herbalism, birth, illness, death, intuition, direct communion, and forms of knowledge that lived outside formal authority. As has been the case since Adam's first wife Lilith, and long before, women who do not conform to authority have repeatedly been framed as a threat to power, and framed as being dangerous. Artists began to visualize the Witches' Sabbath, bringing these stories to life and escalating the fear. Hans Baldung painted witches preparing for flight, naked, surrounded by smoke and creatures, their bodies twisted in ecstasy or corruption. Goya centuries later painted the Sabbath as a nightmare. Figures gathered around a goat-headed devil, faces distorted, the air thick with dread. These images did not depict reality. They depicted fear, given form, the Sabbath as it existed in the imagination of those who hunted it, an image constructed, repeated, and made visible in order to control a population. And imagination was enough. Because once the Sabbath existed on paper, in trial records and treaties, in woodcuts distributed across Europe, it could exist anywhere. Any unexplained illness, the failure of crops, any sudden death, any social tension. The Sabbath provided the explanation, and the explanation demanded action. Neighbours turned on each other, even family members. The accusation of witchcraft became a sentence as good as death. And anything that could be remotely construed as witchcraft, even the act of gathering outside church authority, was now fully demonised, criminalised, and treated as grounds for arrest, torture, and execution. The Sabbath did not need to be real. It needed to be coherent, and it was. However, once the Sabbath existed as an image, neither it, nor the older practices it falsely represented, would ever fully disappear. Whilst it is now clear why the concept of the Sabbath became deeply feared, it is important to separate what people believed from what actually existed. In overwhelmingly Christian communities, demonic gatherings, devil worship, and the embodiment of evil were ideas already charged with terror, ready to be believed, repeated, and enforced. What the Sabbath represented was feared because of what it implied. Not the flying, not the dancing, not even the devil himself. What terrified authorities most was the structure they believed lay beneath the spectacle. A hidden network, operating in secret, meeting regularly, coordinating across distances. A system of knowledge and ritual imagined to exist entirely outside church control, outside state sight, and outside any mechanism that allowed for audit or suppression. And that women, especially women, could claim knowledge, status, and agency in spaces that men could not access or police. This was authority without permission, and why the Sabbath connects directly to the fears we have traced before. The fear of paganism, the fear of druids, the fear of systems that operate orally, locally, and outside written law. The witch was dangerous not because she cursed cattle or ruined crops, though she was accused of both. She was dangerous because she represented a worldview that did not require Christianity to function, one that predated it, and one that might well survive it. The Sabbath was that worldview rendered visible in the imagination of its persecutors, made organised, made coherent, and therefore made prosecutable. None of this is a description of modern witchcraft as it is practiced today, and that distinction matters. Modern expressions of witchcraft are diverse and consciously shaped by the worlds they inhabit. In many ways, these modern practices are far closer to the kinds of local, embodied, experiential knowledge that once unsettled religious and legal authorities, much more than the horrors of a demonic Sabbath ever were. But the image endured because fear survives better than facts. The Sabbath persists in popular culture, in art, in fiction, in the way witchcraft is imagined, rather than practiced. Not because it was real, but because it transformed intuitive, local, embodied forms of power into something monstrous. And the monster could be chased, hunted down, and destroyed. While the population feared the fantasy, it was the reality beneath that authority feared. That power could be accessed directly, that knowledge could be felt, inherited, and practiced, rather than authorized. But none of this means the practice themselves vanished, only that their image became distorted. The Witches' Sabbath was feared because it worked. It organized fear. It gave chaos a face. It turned suspicion into evidence and evidence into execution. Thousands died not for attending Sabbaths, but for confessing to them, for being tortured until they described them, for naming others who would be tortured in turn. The Sabbath became real in the only way that mattered. It became real enough to kill for. And that is the lesson. Not that people believed foolish things, but that belief is not required for violence. Only a coherent story that explains enough to justify action. A thing does not need to be real to become real enough to kill for. The Witches' Sabbath was not real in the way it was imagined, but it would be a mistake to think that everything beneath it vanished. The Sabbath was constructed from fragments. Distorted and exaggerated, yes, but those fragments were drawn from practices, experience and beliefs that already existed at the edges of sanctioned life. Forms of healing passed through families rather than institutions. Ritual knowledge learned through repetition and not scripture. Seasonal observance rooted in land, body and memory rather than calendar decree. Experiences of vision, intuition, spirit encounter that resisted easy explanation. This was not witchcraft as demonology defined it, but they were forms of knowing that did not require permission, and so when authorities attempted to erase them, they adapted. Some retreated into the private sphere, becoming domestic, familial, unrecorded. Some were stripped of language and survived only as unspoken habit or custom. Some were interpreted through Christian symbolism, folklore or superstition, and some were absorbed into the very structures that had once condemned them, medicalized, moralized, or reframed until their origins were no longer visible. The image of witchcraft, and with it the Sabbath itself, also endured, not as lived practice, but as symbol. So when witchcraft reappears in the historical record, it does not return in secret. Instead it re-enters cautiously, fragment by fragment, often under different names. In the 18th and 19th centuries, cunning folk, charmers, herbalists and healers continued to work openly in villages across Britain and Europe. Sometimes tolerated, sometimes feared. Their knowledge was practical. Illness, protection, fertility, weather. Ultimately problem solving, not devil worship. Comparable figures appear elsewhere too. In colonised North America, in forms of folk magic shaped by migration and necessity. The underlying impulse was familiar. People turning to local knowledge when official systems failed. They may not have called themselves witches, but others often did. By the late 19th century, antiquarians and folklorists began collecting what remained. Songs, charms, seasonal customs. Much came too late to be wholly accurate, and was filtered through a romantic lens. And so the past was often not preserved intact, but rather refracted through longing for meaning and enchantment. Then, in the 20th century, witchcraft re-enters history deliberately, not as accusation, but as identity. Modern traditions emerge that openly reclaim the word witch. There are many, many possible roots, which would be an entirely different video for another time. Wicca, for example, was formalised in the mid-century and does draw on ritual structure and the sacredness of nature, but consciously shaped for a modern world. Others seek a more close reconstruction from fragmentary sources. Others emphasise intuition and direct encounter, with some rejecting structure altogether. Figures such as the devil are not revived necessarily as literal beings, but treated symbolically: transgression, liminality, forbidden and occult knowledge. There is no single interpretation, only divergence. But what unites these expressions is not doctrine, it is choice. Witchcraft now is entered voluntarily, practiced openly, debated, critiqued even from within. And yet the unease remains, because even stripped of demons and fantasy, modern witchcraft still touches the same fault lines that once made the Sabbath terrifying. It no longer needs secrecy to be unsettling. Its very openness challenges assumptions about where power is meant to reside. And so witchcraft returns, not as a relic of the past, but as a modern response to conditions that never fully disappeared. Different in form, different in language, but still recognisable in what it offers, and in what it unsettles. Witchcraft no longer needs the devil to be feared, nor secrecy, accusation, or imagined midnight gatherings. And yet even in its modern forms, it continues to provoke discomfort, suspicion, and resistance. Of course, this is in part, and in large part, because of the social conditioning around the word itself, and what it represents. It's an inherited hangover from a deliberate reshaping of both the term and the practices associated with it. These ideas are hard to get rid of, even among secular minds. And the unease was never really about demons. It was about the intangible, the misunderstood, and about where authority lives. Witchcraft, past and present, refuses a single source of permission, does not rely on sacred texts handed down intact, does not require institutional approval to function. Its knowledge is learned through doing, through repetition, through relationships, with the land, the body, the spirit, and with uncertainty. That kind of knowledge has always been difficult to govern, and it's also its intangible nature, so hard to define, which generates fear in its own right. It is not black and white, it is deeply personal, not standardized or unified, and that lack of clarity can make it feel alien. An alien is often threatening. Put all of this and much more into the societal cauldron, give it a stir, and it becomes clear why there are so many overlapping layers of fear surrounding the word witch and the ideas attached to witchcraft, whether imagined, inherited, or lived. So even now, stripped of fearsome imagery, and even with the vast bodies of scholarship, academic grounding, and historical context, witchcraft still gestures towards forms of meaning that operate outside dominant systems. It privileges experience over doctrine, practice over belief, participation over obedience. And that has consequences. Because systems built on hierarchy, even as they become increasingly secular or religiously fractured, tend to distrust what cannot be standardized, audited, or fully explained, what cannot be clearly categorized, and what refuses to resolve into a single truth. The Sabbath once gave that anxiety a shape, via a story and a spectacle. Today the spectacle has faded, but image and tension remains. Modern witchcraft is not a clear survival of the past, but it is still of it. It is not a simple rebellion against past or present authority, but it is not contained by them either. So in its many forms, it becomes a response to recurring human conditions, disconnection, loss of meaning, distance from land and cycle, dissatisfaction with inherited structures of authority. And in that sense, witchcraft does not return as an echo, it returns as a re-answering. Not to the question of whether the devil exists, whether demons can be controlled, spirits contacted, or whether magic is real, but to a deeper one. Who decides our own meaning, and who decides how meaning is made? The Witches Sabbath was feared because it imagined an alternative world, organised, coherent, and beyond church control. Witchcraft itself persists because that alternative never entirely vanished. It changed its language. It shed its monsters. It does argue with itself, but it continues to surface wherever people seek forms of power, knowledge, and belonging that do not flow from a unified authoritarian centre. And that perhaps, more than any demon ever did, explains why the idea of witchcraft has proven so difficult to bury. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into the world of hidden practice and ritual, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It genuinely helps support the channel. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, what we fear often says more about what we don't know than what we do.